Good evening. My name is Jennifer Rosenheitz, and I am the Madison Group Lead for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. And we are a nonpartisan group of individuals. You don't have to be a mom to belong to our group. And we're advocating for common sense gun legislation to help keep our families and kids safe while also respecting the Second Amendment. So I'm glad to be here tonight.
Welcome. I'm Dan Feaster. I'm the Executive Director of the Samaritan Counseling Center. We're in Monona. We're a nonprofit mental health center working with children to older adults.
Hi everyone, I'm Ryan Herringa. I'm an assistant professor and pediatric psychiatrist at the UW. I do a lot of work helping kids with and families with trauma and dealing with violence.
Hi there, my name is Anna Moffitt, and I currently work at an organization called Wisconsin Family Ties. I serve as a parent peer specialist. So Wisconsin Family Ties works with families that have children and youth that have mental health needs or behavioral challenges, and we're all parents of children and youth that have mental health needs as well.
Good evening, my name is Andrew Burdell. I'm Superintendent of Schools in McFarland School District right down the road.
Hi, my name is Dan Olson. I'm the Superintendent of the Monona Grove School District.
Hi, I'm Luke Wunsch of the Monona Police Department, and I'm the School Resource Officer with the Monona Grove School District.
Hi, Jim Ritter with the City of Monona Police Department, the Community Resource Officer.
I'm Tim Paraguay. I'm a lieutenant with the East District.
Roberta Stolick, I'm one of the mental health officers for MPD.
Carlin Becker, I'm also a mental health officer for the North District.
That's certainly a really complex question. There's a lot that goes into that. What we do know that we have many students with all kinds of needs, and whether it's specifically mental health needs, whether there are issues that students feel isolated, alone, and all that plays into, really a key piece is it's so important as a school district to really know our children so that when we can identify that these exist, that we can try to support and get the help that they need. So specifically the question about how does it play into school shootings, I'm not an expert into that. What I am responsible for, though, is to trying to make sure that we always have assistance for our students that do have those needs.
I would echo what Dan said. One piece I'd add is how important it is for students to feel connected in school and to feel welcome and safe and have a strong sense of belonging. And in terms of preventing things from happening, small things even, I think it's really important. What we've been reminding folks in our district lately is if you see something that seems amiss, please say something to an adult. Let us know, and we'll investigate and try and understand what's going on. Even sometimes something very small can be really important. So that also plays into the sense of being a sense of family and having a strong sense of connectedness with school.
One thing that's really helpful to the extent that we can do it is building in integrated mental health surveillance and treatment within the schools. As far as identifying kids, that's where they are, such a significant percentage of their lives. And yet in many instances it's difficult to have those services built in, or if kids are identified, then it can be difficult for them to access treatment out in the community.
I think it's really important for mental health screening, and more districts are looking at that to really identify at-risk kids. I think another component is, for parents to be aware of monitoring how much screen time kids have, and if they're playing violent video games where they're shooting people or even watching violent movies. I mean, that desensitizes them to violence and also can be a risk factor as well.
I just want to add one more thing to that, because I think an important theme that's come up already is this sense of connection, the sense of community. And so what Deanne's talking about is really signs of a child becoming isolated and not feeling connected. And I think that is absolutely crucial. What we know about a lot of the people who have engaged in school shootings is that there's often this marginalization, that they've been disconnected from such an important community.
I would just like to add something to that as well, as a parent of a child with mental health needs and as an advocate for other children, is that when we talk about gun violence, many times we point to mental health or mental illness, and really when we look at the data, what we do know is that people with mental health challenges tend to be the victim far more often of violence than the perpetrators. And so we always need to make sure that we're talking about that, that we're aware of that, and we don't further marginalize people that have mental health differences.
Can I add to that? I'm not a mental health professional, but do have mental health issues myself. No, I think all of us, can somehow identify with, the struggles in our daily lives. And that does not necessarily mean that we have a diagnosable mental condition. However, from the perspective of our organization, we've taken a deep dive into a lot of the data. And one of the things that we don't talk about is that gun violence, 96 people a day lose their lives to gun violence, and the majority of those gun violence incidents are not mass shootings. So the mass shootings are what get our attention and set us off, but it is far more going on there than meets the eye. And about half of those deaths are actually suicide by gun. And what we know about that as well is that oftentimes it's an impulsive decision, and people have access to firearms, easy access. And so one of the things that we talk about, especially with kids, is making sure they don't have access to firearms. So keeping those weapons unloaded, locked, separate from ammunition. Access makes things a lot easier. So if kids cannot get their parents' firearms, then they're going to be much safer from committing suicide or from getting those guns and using them against classmates.
Most states have their own set of laws, and no, there's not background checks done here in Wisconsin.
There are not background checks in Wisconsin.
For certain occupations there are, like taxis and stuff like that, but not in general.
It depends if you buy from a licensed gun dealer or not. Nationwide, almost 50% of the gun sales are private. So you can go on Craigslist and list your gun and sell it to somebody sight unseen without any kind of background check. And when you talk about universal background checks, we really want to talk about making those truly universal so that every gun sale has to go through a licensed dealer who has to then complete that federal process. And we know that there are also loopholes in that system that currently need to be tightened up. Domestic violence. We have a relatively strong law in Wisconsin that was passed, I think, last year, trying to keep weapons away from domestic abusers who have been convicted. Domestic violence is actually a huge indicator for mass shooters. We know there is a super high correlation between someone who demonstrates domestic violence and someone who goes on to harm others. But you're right, it's not a comprehensive system, and certainly from state to state, it can be very, very different.
So that's a really difficult question and a good one. I think part of the best thing that parents can do is just start by listening. Ask your child, ask your teenager, what it is that they've heard, what are they worried about, what are their thoughts that are going on, with regards to mass shootings, to school safety. How do you explain those types of events? How do you explain the actions of somebody who actually carries out this kind of terror, this violence, right? I think what I recommend to families, at least to try to do, is to understand that for somebody to reach the point where they're carrying out that kind of act means that they're already disturbed in some way. And oftentimes, they've grown up, I should say, with a very difficult set of circumstances. They may themselves have been abused or seen abuse and violence. There may be other difficulties going on with them, such as being bullied themselves in the past or marginalized from their groups that they would otherwise connect with. So I don't mean to suggest that all of that is an excuse for carrying out the violence, but I think to the extent that we can help our kids understand why somebody would do such an atrocious and horrible thing, perhaps that can be helpful.
Yeah, I would add, I think sometimes helping kids to understand, sometimes people just make bad choices for a variety of reasons, and there really aren't always good answers. Why would somebody do that? I mean, there isn't an answer that makes sense. I think those people that maybe have a faith tradition or spirituality, sometimes they can use that in terms of talking to kids. But letting people, the kids know that it's not many people, but it's a few people that, for whatever reason, they're angry and they're out of control and do the harm.
One other thing too, I have 3 young children, and I would say I don't have my children watch the news because I think it's really traumatic and negative. And they're aware of the issues, but I do think for folks that have children within schools, another thing that should be talked about is we're hearing more and more about code red drills, active shooter drills, and I think that is something that families should be opening up and talking about with their kids, because that can be very scary for a child to be put in that situation. And so I agree, listen to them, but really check in with them and ask how did they feel about that, what happened today, who were they with, and making sure that we're talking about that too, because that's a relatively new part of our children's lives.
We have a variety of things. We start by working very closely with the McFarland Police Department and our own safety committee, and we work hand in glove with them. But we have, our entrances are secure. We have drills that we do with students and with faculty. We practice a variety of things, including tabletop discussions about if this were to occur, what might we do? What are some things that we might do here? We do shelter-in-place drills, of course. One of the things that we're really, anytime there's a big event, we always review our safety procedures routinely, but particularly when there's a high-profile event like what happened in Florida, we take a special review of our own procedures. And one of the things that we're looking at more, as many districts are, and I'm sure Dan will speak to this, is the shelter-in-place approach has been a long-standing part of safety drills and approaches in schools, but also the concept of a self-evacuation, where if there is an opportunity to leave a dangerous situation safely, take it. You don't necessarily have to stay right where you are. But without getting into all the nuts and bolts of the details of that sums it up pretty well. I think one of a number of folks to my right mentioned this earlier about talking with students and with staff members about how are you feeling about things and what do you need. And I got to talk with 2 high school students today, and we were meeting on a different topic altogether, but I started by just asking them, how are you feeling about things? And one of the things that they both mentioned was they have a heightened sense, they feel safe in school. I was very glad to hear that. They feel safe in school. And they also both said they have a heightened sense of awareness of their surroundings. So they might walk into a space, whereas before they might not have so readily thought, how will I exit this space? Is there another way to get in and out? And they're just more aware. And these were just 2 students that I spoke with today. But I think those ongoing conversations are, in addition to the drills and procedures and protocols in place, having a running conversation about this is very important.
Yeah, and honestly, Andrew, that was very similar, that all schools are trying to do. A couple of things along with that process that we really have been focusing on lately is Number one, the training. So we spend a lot of time with our school resource officers, with other consultants about what are the best practices, but then how do we train staff? How do we train students? How do we talk to them about that? How do we talk to parents about it? The idea of communication is another thing we've been spending a lot of time on. When I first got into school administration, it was shortly after Columbine, and when schools started putting it together, things like lockdown drills and so on. And at that time, it was really the conventional wisdom was, well, we really don't want to share those out publicly because we don't want any potential shooters to know what our plans are. Well, then there's a lot of, so parents really don't know. We'd say, well, trust us, we have a plan. One of the things we've talked about more lately is, it is okay to share, some things or more details than we have, and we have to do that. Parents, what we talked about earlier, so that parents can have those conversations with their children. They need to understand what we're doing as schools as well. So, we were in the process as well this year of in doing an audit, reviewing our plans, and like Andrew said, when something like this happens, there is a little bit more of a heightened sense of urgency, and so we actually did move up our timeline a little bit. We are going to have some parent meetings at the beginning of April to talk exactly about that. What are we doing? Where are we going with our training? And then reevaluating again. We had a meeting this afternoon with our administrative team to talk about that. How do we talk to kids? And the idea that we have to constantly reevaluate, adjust, and learn from that is not as much as there's been so much information, and we've come a long way since Columbine. There's still not the perfect solution. Here's what you do as a school. So we have to constantly reevaluate.
Can I add? I'm curious. I've heard these questions, and what? So if say a student is concerned about a classmate and thinks that it's this see something, say something. What's in place if they came or alerted a teacher? Are they going to be called out by the other classmates and harassed? How can they anonymously do that? What is the system there for reporting for students? Or
yeah, and that goes right in line with a lot of things. With our anti-bullying efforts, the same thing that we want students to be able to feel comfortable that they can speak to an adult in the building and feel safe in doing that. So that is something that ties in with our other types of things as well. So yes, something our counselors, of course, and teachers, administrators are all trained and really trying to reassure that. So that is the key, though, wanting our students to feel comfortable that they can and should report things.
Sure. Again, I agree with what Dan has said, and McFarland's very similar in that regard. The bullying and harassment policies that include reporting procedures also include whistleblower protection, so that if I make a report in good faith, there's no retaliation on me as the reporter there. A little bit more technical side of things, I suppose, is that when a report comes in from a student, a staff member, anonymously or with a name attached to it, that report it can come in anywhere. We have some online reporting tools that are anonymous. We have, obviously, any adult in the building is a place where you can say, hey, I saw something that made me uncomfortable, or I want to let you know. That information goes to a combination of people, including the school administration and student services staff, and our school resource officer, like Dan. We have a fantastic school resource officer in McFarland. And when it's necessary, we do a threat assessment protocol on what we learn. And the school resource officer is able to be exactly what his title is, a resource to the school to help us understand what the implications of that information are and what the best course of approach is for response.
Yeah, I may have actually planted that question, I'm not sure. If not, clearly it's on others' minds as well. I think this is a really legitimate question we need to ask ourselves as a community and a society. I personally struggle with this because obviously there's the First Amendment issues, right, and freedom of the press, and the press needs to be able to give people the information that they need and deserve. On the other hand, I do think, and I know some news agencies have curtailed this, I do think covering specifics of the perpetrators of these incidents is potentially dangerous. And it risks sensationalizing their behaviors and making them a role model, if you will, for copycats. So that would be my sort of minimum, initial suggestion, is that at the least that we encourage news organizations to limit coverage of the nature of the perpetrator himself. Do you guys have a...
I would love to
Yeah.
just lob in with that.
Yeah.
I'm also a writer and write for a parenting website called Scary Mommy. And for National Suicide Awareness Month, I wrote an article about suicidality in kids. And it was one of the worst things I have ever had to write, to speak with parents who have lost their children. And one of the things that I think was really interesting was that, there is, from my conversations with a child psychologist whom I spoke with about this article, is that especially in children, that knowing someone who has themselves committed suicide puts those children at a greater risk for suicidal thoughts and or for carrying through with that. And I believe that the same is also true with mass shootings, that there is a certain copycat kind of thing that happens, and I don't know that is really understood, but especially that kids are susceptible to that. So when Anna was talking about really monitoring her kids, what kind of information they get and from where. It's always better as a parent if you are the one who is contextualizing information rather than your kid just having the news on in the background. And I understand a lot of homes, kids have access to different kinds of media, but it's really not necessarily great for their mental health. They're not getting something that is contextualized and where a parent is saying, well, let's talk about this. How is that making you feel? And then being able to address those concerns. So I think media certainly can play, and social media, I also should say specifically, can have some deleterious effects.
I would just add, finding a balance, because we need to report what's going on in concerns, but I know one of the national trends is with gang violence is not to advertise which gang is doing it, because then there's the copycat and the real sensationalizing that people want to do, kind of like the Jesse James outlaw. It's like, oh, I want to do some of those types of things, and so not encouraging that. Another dimension is like after 9/11, people would just be obsessed watching TV and then get more and more depressed. And so kind of limiting some of that, I think, is more healthy from an emotional standpoint.
A lot of it is just self-awareness. What's going on around you? Do you understand the physical layout of the structure that you're in? So if you're going to a meeting or you're going out to eat with your family, whatever that venue is, it's situational awareness. And that's one of the things we really try to drive home in our training with active shooter response is look around, look where the other exits are in the building. If you have to go to barricade, for example, because you have an active shooter in part of that structure you're in, what rooms do you have access to? In your businesses, a lot of times businesses will use electronic key cards. Well, not everybody has the same access to all those different rooms, so know ahead of time where you can go if you need to go to try to barricade and get away from the shooter, if that's the best option. So a lot of it's just, it's knowing your surroundings, pre-planning. A lot of it, we say that if you plan to fail, you're failing them. If you plan to fail, you're planning to fail.
If you fail to plan, you're planning.
I like the group participation. So
everybody knows.
So yeah, a lot of it is just, it's common sense things that we present in the active shooter training that the department does for civilians, and it's just trying to get people aware of kind of what those incidents look like, how fast they happen. Most of these incidents start and stop before the police even get there. So what do you need to do as a civilian to better protect yourself until we do get there, okay? So it's just trying to dial in a little bit more as far as the particulars of what these incidents look like, give you guys some background, but then also leave you with response options. There's different programs out there. We use the Avoid, Deny, Defend response options from the Alert organization, the CRACE program that we train. And again, it's not hard stuff to grasp, it's just knowing when is it better to avoid versus deny access or go to barricade. If we have to fight for our lives because the shooter is now on top of us, what does that look like? You hear a lot of statistically, the numbers of incidents are going up all the time. Every year we get more and more incidents, okay? And these shooters, these suspects are getting better at what they do. They pre-plan better than they used to. So you look at our body counts are going up in these incidents, okay? But what can we do as civilians to limit those body counts? And that's really what we want to dial in, because you guys are not helpless just because you're civilians, just because you don't have a training in weapons or access to weapons in a workplace, for example. There's things you guys can do to be better prepared, and that's what we really want to train people to do, is recognize what those things are that you guys have control over, and then empower you to know when to do different things, if that answers the questions. Have a plan. A plan is better than no plan, okay?
I was hoping to lob in with that a little bit. Our organization, our parent organization, Everytown for Gun Safety, actually collects a lot of research about gun incidents. Were there other people who were armed? What ultimately stopped the shooter, things like that. And there has, since Columbine, there has been no mass shooting in the United States that has been stopped by another person who is armed. Let that sink in. Pulse nightclub, there was an armed guard. There were other people who were concealed carrying there. We know at the school shooting that there was an armed guard. Actually, many places there are people who are concealed carrying. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind as people are feeling maybe insecure, that generally when these things happen, gun sales go up. And so there is more fear, and more fear leads to more guns. And generally in these situations, when they've asked people who were concealed carrying, why didn't you shoot? And they said, well, it was total chaos. Either I didn't know whom to shoot, or I was afraid that I was going to be seen as the perpetrator. So we also know there was a mass shooting in a Denver Walmart a couple of months ago, and the perpetrator was on the loose for 12 hours because there were so many people in that Walmart who had drawn their guns that they had no idea who the shooter was. So they had to go through the security tape and rule people out one by one. So, I think that police can probably speak a little bit about that, that civilians are not vigilantes, and actually statistically we've shown that, that it's not necessarily useful. There are a lot of techniques that you can use that don't require you to be armed.
Speaking to somebody else having a firearm, whether that be in a business or elsewhere, a school in my case, I find it difficult to deal with that, because right now, in my opinion, I'm the only one in my school with a firearm, and I like that idea. I don't have to worry about a teacher or a staff member or a parent coming in from outside and wondering, are they the active shooter? What do I do with that? That's a scary thought, right? I don't think there's a direct answer for that, because it has its benefits to having concealed carry people with firearms, or arming teachers, as some people want to do. I don't know that there's a simple solution to that.
I don't think there's like one solution. It's, it's not bringing the gun into the school is going to stop everything, as you articulated down there, without actual facts of everything. I think there has been a few instances where potential incidents have been stopped by law enforcement, with subjects entering into facilities or even carrying concealed people. Now what those people were going to do, I don't know, because they were stopped. So, it's hard to say that they prevented something, but what did they prevent? We will probably never know what the totality of what that would have been, because it was stopped. There's a lot more to go on than just saying every teacher needs to be armed. I'm not an educator when it comes to students. I can't walk into a school and start teaching a kid how to read. because I don't have that education. However, I do have the education of firearms training. I'm a firearms instructor. I'm also an EVOC driving instructor. So I can train on those things. I can teach people those things. But just to say that every teacher or certain teachers need a pay increase to be able to carry a gun, I think we need to look beyond that than just throwing out little tidbits here. There's a lot more to go in. Schools' security needs to be heightened. You know, in Verona, they're looking at their new school district, and it's this huge wide open concept with multiple windows in each of the classrooms. They're now discussing what they can do different because now's the time. They're looking at creating a new building, and with that huge open concept, that could potentially be deadly for people if this were to ever happen in Verona. And so it's not taking the CRACE class is not the end all to know all. You gotta keep going with it. We teach that in Monona, to Monona residents, and we did it for the your alliance there. So it's more than just that one step. We need to keep going with this. So yeah, I'm not against firearms, and I'm not all for firearms. So you know, kind of
So we're in the middle.
We're in the middle. So yeah.
Well, I can speak to, you know, we're very glad that we have our school resource officers. Now, differentiating that between an armed guard, I'd much rather have a trained resource officer, and so if we had an opportunity for more resource officers, absolutely, I'd advocate for that, because they do so much more than strictly, you know, work at security, the education piece, and so on. The other things, I don't have a strong opinion. I don't know where we're going. I think, you know, we look at our school security. Of course, we need to do everything in our power to make our schools as secure as possible. But that, to me, is really the last resort. So much more has to go into the preventative part that we've talked about earlier today, that we don't have people showing up at schools with guns. In the event it happens, of course, every possible thing that we can do, we want to, but I don't think that is the solution, you know, to this problem.
Dan, I agree. I'd love to have more school resource officers in McFarland. Officer Miller with us is tremendous, and he's a resource for families as much as he is for schools, as I know your colleagues are as well. The community center comment you made is interesting. I'm not quite sure what's behind that thought, but thinking about how that might translate in schools, you know, I think my mind immediately goes to our student services group. So that includes counselors and school psychologists and social workers and folks whose specialties in their training and their expertise is to support students with unique needs emotionally, behaviorally, things that, as our guest on my right here have said, are often precursors to violent behaviors. Not always, but can be. And I think, you know, in McFarland, we're bolstering those resources going into next year. We're going to be able to add some staffing in that area to address some of those needs. Now, I go back to what I said earlier. I think one of the most important things that we can do for prevention is to be really well connected with our kids and our families, and to understand what their needs and their challenges are long before something presents with a shooter approaching the school.
So, and one other comment to add to that, I do think we can talk about school security, and just so folks know, I also serve on the school board, so I don't say that because it's kind of like being a lawyer sometimes. People get really mad at you. But I think when we can talk about school security, but I do think we do have to also be talking about the preventative things. And I do think the research does show that if there are fewer guns in the community, there's a less likely risk that there will be gun violence. And so I do like to bring the focus back to that and not just security. And I also think too, when we're talking about security, what we talked about is before we put armed guards into our schools, we need to arm our schools with counselors and social workers and psychologists and small classes and specialists. We can't move to armed guards when we haven't first made sure our students' needs have been met.
Absolutely.
piggyback onto that, I think what she's saying is a lot goes back to education, right? Educating our families, educating the communities, educating the schools. It doesn't matter what kind of training you have, or if you don't have any. If you don't have the education, you don't have the tools you need in the time of actual need, right? So if you don't have that, we're lacking resources all across the board. Well, that's a tough question. I'd like to defer to Dan. I don't know that I have the proper answer for that. I wear the soft uniform most of the time. I wear plain clothes to make myself more approachable to students and families as they come into the school. I work very closely with my administration team and Dan. I think that's very helpful. We communicate whether we're having children or families that are struggling with issues, and we don't have all the answers. So we bounce everything off of each other and use each other's information and resources to make ourselves the best we can be to help with the information that needs to be provided.
Do the kids at school know that you're a police officer?
Oh, yeah.
Do they know that? Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think it helps the younger kids seeing me in the schools. You can build those relationships with them earlier. You break down the common barriers that law enforcement have with people in the community. And they realize that you're just another person. You have a job, but you can talk to them about their ongoings of the day, what's going on at home, the sports, the weather, all the stuff that everybody else can. And building those bridges and those relationships goes a long way to being able to educate and make inroads with other issues.
Yeah, and I think I wouldn't want a child to have to make a choice. Should I talk to a resource officer, to a counselor, to a principal, to a teacher? We want our students to feel that they have any adult that they have a relationship that they can trust. And so knowing that we want to make all of our staff accessible, make students feel that they can go to any staff member, but certainly some are going to have preferences over others, and it doesn't matter. We'll communicate with each other and get the person, to get the information to the right person.
So the way it would typically work at this point is that if somebody is in crisis, let's say a child or teenager is having thoughts of hurting themselves or others, hopefully that would be brought to our attention, whether it's from the schools or the family, or that teenager or child themselves may ask for help at that point. Then it's really up to our mental health system to try to take care of them. That can often be done on an outpatient basis, meaning they don't have to be admitted to the hospital, but it may mean more intensive types of behavioral and psychotherapies to help them get through a very difficult time. Sometimes it does mean hospitalization, which is usually the last resort, but oftentimes what needs to happen in those cases. I think, as was mentioned earlier, there are mental health crisis units that also do operate in some of the schools. This is not necessarily all schools, but schools lucky enough to have those services, that can be an option as well for assessment and deciding how to best help that child and his or her family at that point. But it's challenging, and oftentimes there just aren't enough services or beds available, or it's difficult to get into a mental health provider often as quickly as these kids might need to.
I would just add, well, oftentimes it might be voluntary. A parent will bring a child in that they have concerns about. I mean, sometimes they're ordered. I've worked with kids that are court ordered, as an alternative to the criminal system, that they need to follow through with an assessment and work on anger management skills to get back into school. So sometimes it's coming from the school, sometimes from law enforcement. But that has a lot of clout too, because as opposed to a kid that doesn't want to be there, it's kind of like, okay, but if you don't cooperate, then you're not going to be able to go back to school. So there are times that can be helpful.
Also, from the parent perspective that I would add is if you're a parent of a child or youth that may have significant health needs, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to the mental health units within your police department and get to know those folks, let them know about your kid, let them know how they may present if they're in a crisis situation, because we do see times where people are having a mental health crisis and it's gone the wrong way, and I think we can prevent that more by communicating with the police department and making sure that they're aware of what could be going on.
It kind of all starts with communication. So if you can take it upon yourself to spend a few extra minutes talking with that child or talking with that person and just being with them and trying to find what's going on. People, I think, oftentimes feel like they don't know what to do, or they think that if they call us, we'll have all the answers. And while we'll do our darndest to help, sometimes just having that connection with that person to start off with, is being able to talk openly about their feelings is a really huge part of it. And some of that gives time to sort of reduce, I don't know about reduce, but maybe just bring the crisis down a little bit. You know, when the police come in with our, well, we don't always come in with sirens, but when people have engaged in self-injurious behavior or something and we get called and now the ambulance is coming and all those things they kind of amp things up. So if whatever you can do to kind of stay very calm in the situation and just work through it, and then the right people will come. Sometimes we can do a lot of mitigating before people even have to get to the hospital. There's often a lot of safety planning that we can do. So we'll try to find an alternative for people. Maybe hospital isn't the answer, or maybe there's something else we can do. Maybe they can stay with somebody. So we're always looking for that best possible resolution. And what was said about contacting us ahead of time is really helpful too, because it's not that we want to know what every kid that has an issue, but there are times where if we know, we can, just like everything else, prepare a little bit better for it. Maybe there's certain things that are really, really effective with this child and in certain situations that could really help us engage with them and de-escalate before we even have to go to the next step. So having that plan and talking with us and engaging in that relationship building, trust building with children. We go and visit people all the time and just kind of get to know them. We can, especially as full-time mental health officers, we can do a lot of adaptation with our schedule and with our uniform to kind of mitigate some of that scary stuff about police officers. So we are always happy to do that.
One of the things we do from a very early age is we teach our students what is bullying. What does that mean? What does that look like? What can that feel like? And what does one do when one sees somebody else being bullied? What do you do if you feel like you're being bullied yourself? That work is most often done by a combination of people, starting with the classroom teacher and the counselor, and the school psychologist also has a role in that. And that effort starts from the moment kids join us in school and continues all the way through. And it looks a little different developmentally, of course, as kids reach different ages. The idea of inclusion is that, I'm not sure here if that means, particularly in the context of special education, or if that means in a broad sense of being inclusive of people with different personality characteristics and that sort of thing, probably more general sense here. One of the along with the anti-bullying efforts, one of the things that we really try and do with our students, and I'm sure we do in Monona Grove as well, and other districts, is to really create an atmosphere where kids feel welcome. And where everybody has a friend, everybody has a go-to friend, everybody has a go-to adult. Those are really, really important things to have. And that we celebrate difference and diversity, and that's a strength. That's looked at as a strength and not in other ways. Mental health assessments are really, when we start talking about that, we're starting to talk about more specialized skills for people who are formally trained in doing that work, and that takes us into the realm, again, starting with counselors, but also school psychologists, and then working with outside support folks who have even more expertise in that. Clues about that often come up however, in behaviors that we see in the classroom level. And so again, going right back to the classroom teacher, knowing his or her students really, really well, noticing when something might be a little different or a lot different, and looking at what are some of the underlying causes there. And then the classroom, when the classroom teacher sees that, and this can be at any level, that immediately starts a conversation back again with our student services group, which includes counselors and psychologists, to understand what's going on and what some of those needs might be. And at times that does involve coordinating with the school resource officer, who can be a resource to the school, and as I said before, also the family, and to connect to even broader supports that might be available.
Excellent, thank you. I'll address a little bit about the training piece and the communication. So most of our, virtually all of our training starts with our student services staff. So in-house, our student services teams regularly meet. It starts with those individuals being trained, retrained, and then working on developing the training for all of our staff. So for instance, at Monona Grove right now, in addition to our normal, everything that Andrew described, we actually have a special, we call it our mental health work group, that meets specifically to address that need. What are we doing internally? How are we reaching out to other resources? What are our needs? And so that is a separate group that's been in existence now for a few years, to address that need or to at least identify what those needs are with our training and so on. As far as districts communicating with each other, absolutely yes. We are so fortunate in Dane County with 16 school districts that we are so close to one another. And so again, our student services staff, in fact, all of our school professionals regularly meet with each other and constantly are sharing ideas. The other thing that we're so fortunate having those resources not only with each other, being in in the Madison area, having resources and partnerships with UW, with Dane County, it is really very helpful. And so yes, we do take advantage of that opportunity as much as possible.
So I've got one quick thing. I was recently at my cobbler, who makes my shoes look like new again. And the woman behind the counter was incredibly stressed out, and so I got to talking with her about what was going on. And her daughter, she attends Monona Grove High School and is relatively new to the district. And she said that it had just happened. Her daughter was in the parking lot, had been surrounded by a group of 6 girls that were about to jump her. And she said, fortunately, a teacher came out and stopped it. But what to do in that situation? How does that happen? What recourse might there be in the parking lot?
Sure. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is what caused that situation. And it's back to everything that we've talked about already tonight. About those relationships and understanding what's happening with our students, and do we have staff that know those students that are involved, might have an understanding of what led to that event, and then more importantly, where can that student or those students go to seek assistance. The other thing that comes to mind is the supervision, of it's not just in the buildings but in the parking lots as well, and so I think that's honestly very unfortunate. It's something that's disturbing to hear that something like that might have happened. So glad, and that's something that we do have that expectation. We have unbelievable staff that absolutely, of course, would step in and immediately. And so I think the most important thing is, and once that did happen, is that our staff went into action to determine the cause of that and move forward from there.
Any legislation that will help reduce the violence or the access is not a bad thing in my mind. It's just the types of crimes we see on the street with violent crimes, a lot of those guns that are out there are not necessarily legitimate guns. So how do we get those off the street too? So I don't know if that addresses the whole question or not. But
So I can talk a little bit about that. People have questions about whether legislation can do anything about guns that are already out there. And as you mentioned, there's actually, essentially one gun for every human being in this country, which is pretty overwhelming when you consider how many people actually don't own guns. That there's about 3% of the population who are considered super owners of firearms. There are a lot of different things that we can do, and the really important thing, I think, for all of us to think about is that this is not actually a political issue. we have been told for years that we all disagree and that we are essentially split down the middle in this country. And the truth is that 97% of Americans in scientific polls agree on, for instance, universal background checks. Okay, so, you know, take it out of this idea that it's something that we can't talk about and that we all disagree on. There are a lot of things actually we can agree on and just go forward with if our politicians will listen to us. And I'm not saying one side or the other, because my organization works with Republicans and Democrats. Really, we are looking at something that has become a public safety crisis and a public health crisis. And so the good news is that organizations like mine have compiled a lot of the research that has been done. Many people know the CDC is somewhat barred from doing this kind of research. And the reason is because you know, there are powerful lobbies that do not want the information to be released. So, you know, we have a lot of data, and we know we have a lot of different regulatory schemes in different states across this nation, from places where you don't need a permit or training to concealed carry to places like Wisconsin where you have to have a concealed carry permit and you know, do a background check and safety training. So we have a lot of data points that not only can we say, you know, the majority of people would agree with these things, but also that they work. Okay, so I think that we all need to take a step back from feeling like we are powerless when we are talking about these things and that we can't agree. I think we've talked a little bit tonight about communities and how we create empathy in our communities with children. And I think we also need to talk about that with adults. And I think that as a country, now I'm not speaking as as my official thing, but you know, I've seen that we're in a lot of ways afraid to talk to each other, and especially when we disagree. And a lot of that bullying behavior we see in children comes from adults. And it's really our responsibility as adults not only to learn how to speak with each other with kindness and compassion, even if we disagree, but to actively look for compromise. And that's something that, you know, there are a lot of different forces in this country that don't want us to compromise, because on one side or another, they're invested in us not coming to agreement. And when it comes to gun legislation, we know that there are a lot of things that work. We also know that there are some things that aren't terribly effective, like gun buyback programs are not particularly effective. Waiting periods, there's not really enough overwhelming data to support that. And so our organization, for instance, doesn't take sides on that. But there are lots of things that are terribly effective. So when we talk about all of these amazing things that these professionals at this table do, you know, they're doing so with very little resources and with great expectation and weight of our society that these people will solve the problem. And one of the things that I'm here to say is these people are doing all they can. These people are the ones we need to solve the problem. Everyone needs to see that this is their issue. Because what I will tell you is that a lot of people think, well, I don't have to engage in that. That's an icky topic. I don't want to think about it. I'd rather be on the internet or playing Scrabble, honestly. But I'm here with you tonight because I know that if I don't make this my issue, I can't help you understand that it's your issue. And I want you to understand that it's your issue before you have a loss in your family or your community. The people at Parkland, the parents, they don't have that luxury anymore. And I don't want you to wait till the point where you don't have that luxury anymore. This is something that we can talk about now, and that these professionals are here to give their resources as well, but every single single one of you has something that you can do, and that starts with getting informed, getting facts, and deciding that it is important to you, and finding some kind of middle ground.
Well, I came here to listen, but actually, there's a lot we can do. There used to be a law in Wisconsin that the revenue limits that were placed on schools did not apply to school safety expenditures. That law was repealed about 6 years ago, and it could be put back in place. We could require universal background checks. We could, for example, restore funding to special education for the schools. It used to be 10 years ago, the state funded 60% of the cost of special education, which includes a lot of people with emotional health issues. It's now down to less than 20%. We could restore that. It would take a lot of the burden off of the individual school districts to provide much better services. And so those are some of the things that are perhaps less controversial. But we really need to look at what we do in terms of gun regulation. The gun manufacturers, I believe, have done a deliberate effort to misinform the public about the Second Amendment and the recent decisions. It's very clear in the recent decisions, the one in 2008 by Heller and the one in 2010 called the McDonald decision, that although those decisions extended the right to bear arms to individuals, which that didn't used to be the case. In fact, it was very clear, and Justice Scalia, who's the most ardent gun supporter of the Second Amendment of anybody, said that it was subject to reasonable regulation. And he listed some, and it's pretty clear that we can do things like prohibit ownership of certain parts of the population. We just can't do it to the entire population. We can limit the kinds of weapons that are sold. We can limit the magazines that are available to be sold. We can limit how many, the caliber of the weapons. All these things are within currently the jurisdiction. Now, the issue is, just like free speech, when free speech was declared a universal right of all Americans by the Supreme Court, we've had ever since then lots of court decisions to define what are the boundaries of the regulations. For example, we cannot use the First Amendment to commit fraud, cannot use it to commit libel, we cannot use it to commit defend ourselves against child pornography. There's a lot of limitations on free speech. It's not an absolute right, but it is a right, and it's probably the foremost right, because it's the First Amendment. But we're now in that situation of what are the appropriate regulations for guns, for the sale and ownership of guns. And there have been 4 challenges to various state laws in terms of gun regulations that have been challenged. The Supreme Court has chosen to take up none of them, which has indicated that none of the laws that have been passed by states and municipalities have risen to the level where the Supreme Court feels it impairs on the Second Amendment rights that people have. So we have a lot more options available to us than I think most people have been led to believe. And we could pursue those, and we should. So that's one of the things that I'm very much want to pursue during the time that I'm in the legislature, because I think this carnage is just not worthwhile. The public health issue, doing the research, if we had the kind of death from any kind of other threat, we would be knocking ourselves out to try and find out what's causing it and how we can solve it. Requires research to be able to do that, but I think the gun manufacturers recognize that research would point the finger at them. They don't want us to have it, and they've been very effective politically. And I talk about the gun manufacturers. We all normally talk about the NRA. That's, I believe, just the propaganda arm, the political arm, for the gun manufacturers who, in my opinion, and I may be paranoid on this, but I think they deliberately foster this kind of dissension, because whenever there's an issue, their gun sales go up. Yep. Their ammunition sales go up. And it's cold-blooded, and and really antithetical to us. Look at how badly we're separated. Look at the deaths that we've experienced. So the question was, what can we do? And I just want to reassure you, we have the ability to do it if we have the political will.
If we write letters, does that help? Does it?
You know, I think the most effective thing has been what the high school students are doing.
Yeah.
You know, the passion and the fact that they've had to confront this reality, I think is going to do more than anything we could do as legislators. As adults, we've pretty much gotten into our camps, but I think the young people are getting us in our hearts in a way that I haven't seen before. So I have great hope for that. And the other thing I want to say about that, another thing I want to say about that is, I think it's important that young people lead that effort. You know, we can support them, but if this is their movement, this is their effort, and we should take it. We can be the beneficiaries of it, but it's their movement.
I appreciate you saying that, because that's exactly what I was going to say. We've really been talking a lot about what adults can do and what adults are doing. I think this is an issue that we need to look to our youth for guidance on, because this is a reality that they have grown up with, and I truly believe that they do have the answers and they do have solutions, and this is a time to let our youth lead us and guide us and support them, and I think we have a lot to learn from what they are saying and what they were doing. And I know Jennifer did want to say,
Yeah, sorry. You know, our organization works with lawmakers all across the country, and essentially what we've come to is that, you know, as Legislator Miller said, that there are people who are beholden to the gun lobby, and you are absolutely right. After one of these things happens, you can look. The stock market goes up. The shares of these companies. So they are profiting. In the same way that tobacco companies didn't want more regulation of smoking, even though smoking was a public health hazard. So I think that there are some parallels there. But essentially we are at the point where people are so entrenched that really what you need to do is look, where's the money? Where's the money coming from? Okay, are people, you know, getting, you know, we know our campaign finance system is wide-ranging, but if somebody's donor is the NRA, you can bet they are not on your side. They are on the side of the gun lobby. They are not listening to you. They do not want your safety because they profit when you are scared.
I think you made a very valid point about many more people have guns, right? And many more people want to carry concealed. There's the responsibility and the knowledge of carrying that on your person and being aware of it at all times. But then you got to take into the mental aspect of it of, are you prepared to use it mentally if you need to? Are you creating a benefit or a burden to society by carrying that if you're not prepared to use it? Or if you're not trained in how to use it? I think those are the extra mile you got to go to think about that if you're going to conceal carry.
So this is one other thing I want to add to that, and that another source of deaths in children are accidental. Playing with firearms. Kids are really, really curious. And so I think whenever people start talking about this as the solution, it's important to realize that there are also going to be consequences, side effects, if you will, of trying to use that as a solution that may be completely unintended, and yet I think we can foresee them based on what we know from statistics. There's one other point I want to make, because I know we're getting short on time, and that is I think we're also missing something very foundational here, and we touched on this at the beginning. It's really, to me, comes back to this sense of community this sense of connection, of being accepted. That may be in the school, it may be in one's family, the neighborhood, or the community. And I think we really need to consider, how do we get that back? I think we've lost a lot of that in many places in this sort of globalized digital age we live in, where comments can come from everywhere, bullying can come from everywhere. And so I'd like to just plant the notion of, can we institute something from the ground up, whether it's a kindness curriculum, a compassion curriculum, an ethics course that really would be part of our schools. It would be part of what families really are expected to learn and grow along with their kids. So let's not just focus on, stopping the violence or stopping the bullying. How can we actually promote more kindness and compassion in the world?
As I said, my organization collects a lot of statistics, and what we know is that the greatest predictor of mass shooting is domestic violence. A lot of actually mass shootings are domestic violence related. So it could be a domestic violence, where someone maybe goes to the other person's place of work. It is something that, in terms of domestic violence, we know that very often, like right after one person leaves the situation, is the most dangerous time, because the person who is the aggressor feels like they have lost control. We also know that the majority of kids who are killed in mass shootings, it all is domestic violence related. Something else that we've seen is, as perhaps a lesser predictor, or doesn't come up as commonly but is also strongly associated, is cruelty towards animals. So anything where you're looking at, a kind of impaired empathy. And I don't want to say that it's a mental health issue necessarily. I think that these can be learned behaviors, so I think it's really important that we delineate between mental health issues and socio-behavioral issues, in the genesis of these problems. But these are two things that we know really strongly correlate with mass shootings.
Yeah, so I think that's great. The only other points I would add, because I know we're getting short on time, young males are unfortunately the ones most likely to engage in these types of events. If they have a history of substance abuse, that's another big risk factor. If they've been marginalized, again, disconnected from the community and feeling isolated, that's another one. And of course, access to guns.
I want to bring your attention to a group. It's another advocacy group. She was not on the panel, but she's here in the audience. It's an organization called the Sandy Hook Promise. It was the video that we showed. So I just want to let you know about that resource. They have some amazing materials on spotting and kind of looking for signs. And Lauren, would you like to speak a little about that? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I'm never going to get anyone to talk to me ever again. I'm going to run away.
We won't stop talking.
Yeah. I just signed up to be a Sandy Hook Promise leader a week ago after the shooting. So I am just learning all the resources excuse me, that are available. But basically there are 5 different programs that they have that are all free curriculum for specifically schools, school districts, and some of them are, the one is just being able to say hello, just literally just building those bridges, kind of reaching out towards people who are otherwise isolated. There are some assessment tools and just intervention tools. One of them is called a mental health first aid kit. So it's equipping counselors, school psychologists, And so it's a free curriculum. They have, they are funded by donations. It's a nonprofit organization that developed after the Sandy Hook shooting. And so I'm just learning about it, but it's, as far as I can see, a ton of free resources. It's just about linking the schools, the school districts, and folks like myself who just want to do something and get the information connected. So